Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our MDICx teleconference. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Stephanie Christopher. I'm the Program Manager for our MDIC's Patient-Centered Benefit Risk Project. And it's my privilege to welcome you here today for this webinar on two exciting pieces that have come out of recent work in the last couple of months, MDIC's Patient-Centered Benefit Risk Framework Report and CDRH's draft guidance on patient preferences. To introduce our two speakers, our first speaker is Ross Jaffe, who's a member of the MDIC board and the board champion for MDIC's Patient-Centered Benefit Risk Project. He's a managing director at Versant Ventures, where he specializes in early-stage investing in medical devices, and is also director of the National Venture Capital Association. Our second speaker will be Annie Saha. Annie is the Director of External Expertise and Partnerships in the FDA's Center for Devices and Radiological Health. External Expertise and Partnerships coordinates CDRH's Patient Preference Initiative, as well as their Network of Experts program and public-private partnerships, including MDIC. With that, I'll turn it over to our first speaker, Ross Jaffe, to tell us a little bit about the framework report.
Good. Thank you, Stephanie. Can I have the next slide, please? The next slide. So the Patient-Centered Benefit Risk Assessment Project, which was completed and publicly presented back in mid-May, really grew out of the benefit risk guidance the FDA came out with in the spring of 2012. And that was a landmark guidance which established the benefit risk perspective as the basis for approval of medical devices under PMA and de novo applications. And it's since been extended the separate guidance on the use of benefit risk in 510Ks. The guidance, among other things, mentions the value of the patient's perspective on benefit risk. In other words, if you're doing benefit risk determination, from whose perception of benefit risk should you focus on? And in this case, it talks to the value of patient's perspective, but doesn't really give any guidance about how you actually go about collecting information on that preference, on that perspective. So that's what prompted us to consider undertaking a project to look at how you bring the patient's perspective into medical device regulation. Next slide, please. So the vision for the MDIC Patient-Centered Benefit Risk, or PCBR report, as we call it, was really to establish a framework for assessing the patient preferences regarding the probable benefits and risks of a proposed medical device, and then help understand how to incorporate that patient preference information into pre-market and post-market regulatory submissions. Next slide, please. In order to pursue the project, we assembled a large and diverse group of people. There were many who represented the FDA, including Annie, who's on the call, a number of people from industry, members of MDIC from both large and small companies. We also incorporated a number of patient advocacy groups to represent the patient's perspective in this process, and then also had a number of other academic experts, such as Scott Braithwaite from NYU and Sean Tunis and Ray Patrick Lake and others who were valuable in understanding the patients who have expertise in this area and were valuable in bringing a knowledge of the field to the discussion. Next slide. So we broke up the project into three major components. The first is actually a framework, an overview about patient preference information and how to think about patient preference information in the regulatory process. And we're going to walk through this framework in a little more detail this morning. Another major component was to actually go out and catalog all the methods available for assessing patient preference. It turns out that had never been done before, and there's a wide range of techniques from a variety of sources, some from health economics, some from traditional economics, some from consumer research, a wide variety of techniques for assessing consumer preferences or patient preferences. And we brought that all together into one catalog of all the possible methods for assessing patient preference. And then as an outcome of the project, we identified certain areas where there was need for additional work, and we translated that into what we call the agenda for future research. And so these are the three key components that are represented in our catalog, in our PCBR report. Next slide. So we took that group that we mentioned and broke it up into a couple working groups. One focused on the framework, and one focused on the catalog. And the catalog project was actually outsourced to Research Triangle Institute, RTI, an organization that has a lot of expertise in this area, under the leadership of Brett Halber. And then Brett went out and also then recruited a variety of academic experts and people who are very knowledgeable in the specific techniques to help put the catalog together. So these framework working group worked primarily on the framework we discussed. The catalog group really delivered the catalog, which is a major appendix to the report. Next slide, please. And the resulting project was the PCBR framework report, which we titled A Framework for Incorporating Information on Patient Preferences Regarding Benefit and Risk into the Regulatory Assessments of New Medical Technology. And this is, unfortunately, the title doesn't quite roll off your tongue, but it was sort of try to be an accurate description of what's in the report. It was the overarching report of the PCBR project and incorporates both the framework and the catalog and the agenda for future research that I mentioned earlier. And we published it and presented a public forum on May 13th of this year. Next slide. So it's important to understand what the real use of this report is and also its limitations and what it is not. We really view the PCBR report as not a definitive report on how to do patient preference information. We more think it of as an initial thought piece in an emerging area of regulatory science. As I was fond of saying with the group, everybody likes to talk about patient preferences, but it's a very vague area. And our job was to do what I call sculpt the fog, to bring this sort of vague area that everybody's interested in into something concrete. And so we viewed our report as an initial thought piece that helps advance the field, but it's really a work in process that will be updated as FDA and industry and others gain more experience with working in this field. It's also important to realize that the framework is not. It is not the policy or opinion of FDA. In other words, this group was not a formal FDA advisory group. We did not make recommendations to the FDA. We are more a group sitting down and trying to think about this field and how to bring it a coherent framework and some knowledge that could be beneficial to potential users. And it's not a substitute for FDA guidance, and Annie will talk later about the FDA guidance that has come out in this area. And most importantly, it is not a cookbook or prescriptive guide on how to undertake patient preference studies. That was beyond our scope. More is a way to help people think about the field and really make decisions about in what situations and how they might undertake a patient preference, efforts to collect patient preference information for regulatory submissions. Next slide. So this is an overview of the framework outline report. We're not going to walk through this. I'm going to walk through these sections, but on the slide, it's a little too small print. But it basically consists of 8 sections and 2 appendices. And one of those major appendices is a catalog of methods I described, and I'll talk about the catalog as well in more detail. Next slide. So the first section of the framework report really is an introduction to the PCBR project. It sort of recounts a little bit of the history that I spoke about earlier, and describes who the Medical Device Innovation Consortium is, or what the organization does, the origins of the report, the vision that I outlined before, the limitations of the report, and then outlines the remainder of the report. Next slide. The second section is actually quite important because it really tries to define a number of terms that are used throughout the rest of the report. And this is particularly important because many of the terms around preferences and patient's perspective have lay meetings, but we have to define them very clearly for the purposes of what we are trying to do. And they can be used they're often used in a technical manner in the academic literature and in a more general manner in lay terminology. And we sort of had to come up with what we meant in the report. And so we defined some key terms about what are patient preferences, what's the difference between preference and judgment, how to think about risk in terms of risk tolerance and what we call risk attitude, and how to, in the concept of risk uncertainty. And then importantly, and I think this is the key concept we talk about, is what is a preference-sensitive decision? In other words, what are situations in which patient preferences can influence a clinical decision? And we talk about that in this section too. Next slide. The third section of the report addresses an important question about in what situations, in what regulatory situations would patient preference information be useful? And it, again, is not intended to be a cookbook or a prescriptive process, but rather is intended to help sponsors and FDA think about the situations in which this information might be valuable and additive and useful to the regulatory process. And rather than try to specify a checklist or an algorithm for determining that, we really identified three groups of factors to consider and series of questions to consider about whether patient preference information would be useful in that setting. And those factors are, some are related to the perspective as patients and stakeholders in the process, some are related to the benefit risks trade-offs inherent in a specific technology, and the third set are really related to regulatory novelty, and to the extent that the FDA is not familiar with a clinical area or a technology, how can patient preference information be useful in helping the reviewers understand how the patients view that clinical area or that use of that technology. So those, we have a series of questions in the section that really help understand those three sets of factors. Next slide. So one of the key things that's discussed in this particular chapter is how the inherent benefits and risks in a technology really affect whether patient preference information would be valuable. And the way to think about it, we sort of a classic 2x2 table here. In technologies that are high benefit and low risk, in other words, a lot of benefit, not much risk to the patient, patient preference information probably might be nice, but it's probably not that valuable to the regulatory decision. The regulatory decision would be relatively clear. But in other situations, the three other boxes, patient preference information could be useful. There are some technologies that offer high benefits, but also offer significant risks. Good example might be a transcatheter heart valve. And those technologies, understanding that the patients are willing to accept the risk for that level, for the benefit being offered, may be important to helping give comfort to the regulatory reviewers this product should be approved, given the high risk. There are also situations where products offer less benefit. And in those situations, patient preference information can be very useful to say whether there's low risk or high risk. If there's limited benefit, do patients, or at least a subset of patients, want that technology given the limited benefit and given the risks involved? So we found this 2x2 table helpful in thinking about one dimension about thinking of in what settings patient preference information might be useful to collect. Next slide, please. The fourth section of the chapter really tries to get at the issue about when in the product development life cycle can patient preference information be collected and how it might be useful in that entire product development process, including the regulatory submission. And we note that there are three major uses of patient preference information. One is initially in framing the benefit risk issues involved in a certain clinical area or around a certain technology. The second is identifying groups of patients that would prefer the use of technology. In other words, among all the population out there, which are the subsets of patients that have preferences who would say, given the risks and benefits, I'd like to use this technology. And the third use of the collecting patient preference information is really to provide the quantitative inputs that could be useful in doing some benefit risk modeling around, and a good example of such benefit risk modeling is the FDA's own study of obesity devices, and based on assessing the preferences of patients with obesity, they will develop a quantitative model that sort of illustrates how patients trade off benefits and risks. So those are the three major uses of patient preference information. The question comes up, okay, when in the life cycle can you collect that information? And so this section of the report walks through the FDA's product development life cycle and talks about this. And can I have the next slide, please? So this is the product development life cycle. Annie will show a similar version of this slide, a little more detail. When we talk about at each step of this, how patient preference information might be collected and used. Next slide, please. So the fifth section of the report really is about methods and how do you think about selecting methods and undertaking an actual study. And the first part of the report of this chapter summarizes the catalog of methods and talks about the process by which the catalog was developed, the criteria we use to evaluate the different methods, and then summarizes these methods. And then this section goes on to outline three sets of factors to consider in designing a study. And those are factors that relate to how you define the research question, factors related to how the fit of the particular method to your research question, and the third area is factors related to the resources that are available and needed to undertake such a patient preference study. And again, so it's not a cookbook or a checklist process, but we at least try to help people think about what would be involved in undertaking a patient preference study around a specific issue. Next slide. Section 6 goes on to say, okay, you've collected this information. How can you think about using it in the regulatory process? And what we really tried to identify here was a series of questions people had about the requirements for using patient preference information, the timing, how it might be submitted, how it might be used in the regulatory decision process. And so there's a series of questions you can see outlined here that we address in this section. And I won't walk through this in great detail, but this is really designed to help guide people in taking information collected and think about its submission in the regulatory process. Next slide. Section 7 is a relatively short chapter in this section, and it really just was trying to get at the issue beyond the regulatory process. What are the other uses of patient preference information that might be valuable to, particularly to companies developing new technologies, and particularly how this information might get used in reimbursement, coverage decisions, in informing marketing efforts, and in the process of informed consent and shared medical decision-making. In developing the framework of the PCBR report, we kept a laser focus on the regulatory issues. So this chapter does not go into depth, but highlights each of these potential applications as areas that may be of interest to areas where the information collected might have additional value and areas where there might need to be future work. So we didn't go into a detailed discussion here, but so we at least wanted to highlight these issues as part of that. Part of the report. Next slide. The concluding section of the report talks about this issue of what else is needed in this field, what's the agenda for future research. And we really discuss areas that we identified both in developing the catalog and in developing the framework that might be fruitful areas for future research by MDIC or FDA or academic groups or other outside groups. And a key component of this is what we call a gap analysis that was performed as part of developing the catalog. That gap analysis focused really on methodological issues where there could be, we just need more experience or there are issues that need to be addressed. A good example is, how do we know that if we use different methods to assess patient preferences, they come to the same conclusions about an issue? And so one of the things we suggest is doing some studies where we go out and assess patient preferences in the same patient population using different methods and compare and contrast the results. So there's a number of methodological issues that we're hoping that research groups and FDA and industry will try to work on to help advance the field. And then there are several other areas that we we identified as areas of potential importance for future works, one of which is maybe a project we're starting to undertake now, is now that you have all this information on benefit and risk and on patient preferences, how do you best communicate that information to patients who are facing a clinical decision? And so what are best practices around communicating benefit risk information to patients? And so that's one project that we that we're starting to pursue at MDIC right now. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, the second major component of this effort was developing this catalog of methods, which we, again, outsourced to RTI to lead the effort. They got involved, a number of experts around the country in these methods to develop this catalog. And the goal of the catalog was to be really a resource for anyone who's interested in collecting patient preference information to be aware of the methods out there they could use to do that. And it was designed, focused primarily on medical devices, but the catalog is pretty generic, and it should be of value to people working in other fields, including the pharmaceuticals or biologics or other clinical areas. Next slide. Again, it was important to be clear about what the catalog is and what it is not. It's really an introduction to the wide range of methods, patient preference collection methods out there, and a starting point for understanding those methods. But it is not a systematic, detailed review of each of those methods, and not a definitive guide in determining how each of those methods could be used in a particular situation. Again, it's not a cookbook or algorithmic process that says, you know, if you have this situation, here's the method you should use. It more tries to summarize the methods, compare and contrast them on some key major attributes, and then offer, you know, where you might go to get additional information on them. And in particular, it's not a how-to guide of how to do the study. It's not a primer on how to implement each method. More, it's to help people think about what's available, and then they can go out and do further research to decide exactly how they can implement one of these studies. Next slide. As a first step in developing the catalog, similar to what we did in the framework report, we really had to develop a working definition of what these methods are, and to be very clear. And we chose to focus purely on quantitative methods for collecting patient preference information. There are a lot of qualitative ways of sort of getting a sense of patient preferences, but we didn't think those would be strong enough to provide information that would be valuable in the regulatory process. So we focused on patient preference methods as methods for collecting and analyzing data that allow quantitative assessments of the relative desirability or acceptability to patients of attributes that differ among medical treatments. And this focus on quantitative is really important. A really important factor to understand. Again, we're not comprehensive looking at all the qualitative methods like focus groups and individual patient interviews. We really chose to focus on quantitative methods. Next slide, please. And in going so, the working group had to decide, okay, what's in and what's out? What are the criteria we're going to use for deciding whether a method is a quantitative method for assessing patient preferences that we should include in this catalog? And the important things they identify is that the method had to provide information on the relative importance or trade-offs among attributes. It had to be something that had been published, a method had been used in the academic literature and published in the peer-reviewed literature. It had to be something that had been used in healthcare, because there are a variety of things that are done in consumer reports, research, that have really not been extensively used in healthcare. And it had to be able to be used and applied to patients specifically, even if it had only been used in other settings to apply to perhaps physician or other stakeholder preferences. So again, it had to be really a patient preference applicable method that was peer-reviewed in the literature, had been used in healthcare. And that was important to be included in the catalog. Next slide, please. So we came up with, I think there are 16 or 17 methods here that were categorized into 4 major groups. You can see those groups on the side. There's things called structured weighting, where you can basically rank or weight different attributes and their relative importance. There's something called health state utility. There's stated preference, where you actually just ask patients in a variety of ways what their preferences are. And there's an important fourth area called revealed preference, where you actually look at what patients actually choose and as a proxy for what their preferences are. And these groupings are not, were useful, and they may not be perfect, but they were useful in just basically facilitating discussion and comparing and contrasting of methods, because there were a very wide range of methods among these different categories. And in reality, some of the methods that could be assigned to different categories. You could have cut the pie different ways here, but at the end, this is the consensus of the group about the best ways to think about categories for these methods. And I'm not going to try to talk about all these methods today, but if you're interested, you know, that's the catalog provides a very good discussion of them. Next slide. The methods that were excluded from catalog, as I mentioned, were qualitative methods, which are often used in market research and healthcare and other areas, but may not be, we didn't think would stand up to the rigor of the regulatory process. We also excluded patient-reported outcome methods. Patient-reported outcomes are very, very valuable, but they are not measures of patient preferences, they're measures of patient's outcomes. And they really aren't useful in the preference assessment process, although they're vitally important in assessing the outcomes of the treatment. And then the other thing we excluded are multi-criteria decision methods, which are really used to look at decisions, not at preferences. In other words, and the patient preference information is often the input into decision methods, but we weren't trying to get at the decision methods, we're trying to get at the understanding of patient preference. So we didn't do the additions and an analytical methods in this report. Next slide. So each of the reviews of methods includes a clear description of the methods and citations where it's been used in the published literature, and it reviews each of the methods in a consistent way around a set of questions. And some of the questions are about methodology, some are about the sampling process, some are about how you analyze it, and some of what the outputs of the method look like. We try to use a very consistent review process for each of the methods. Next slide. And these are the questions, the types of questions we ask and that are addressed in the catalog. Next slide. So having gone through that review process, the catalog working group noted a number of areas where they just needed more information. And so that we did what we called a gap analysis and looked for areas where more information was needed. And based on that, we raised a number of suggestions for areas of future research. As I mentioned earlier, one of which is, do multiple methods come to the same answer when applied to a specific question? Others really are, you know, similar types of methodological related questions. And we're hopeful that with existing experience in focusing on this field and people starting to do work in this field, that answers to many of these questions will become clear. Next slide. So with that, that's a summary of the framework report, or the PCBR report, the framework, the catalog, and the agenda for future research. The report is available online. There's the URL, and I'm sure Stephanie will emphasize that further and make sure everybody has that link. But we look forward to your feedback on the report. Again, as I said at the beginning, this was not designed to be a definitive final document on the field. It's really an initial thought piece. And we're hopeful that every few years, as we learn more about this field, we can continue to update this report and make it valuable as a resource to people who are interested in understanding patient preferences and potentially using that information in the regulatory process. With that, let me stop and hand it back to Stephanie.
Great, thank you, Ross. And I want to remind everyone that we will have some time at the end for questions. There's a Q&A box on the side of your screen. If you have questions, please type those in and we'll have a chance to address those after Annie's presentation. And with that, I will turn it over to Annie Saha, who will tell us a little bit about CDRH's patient preference activities and their recently published draft guidance. Annie?
Thanks, Stephanie. You can move to the next slide. CDRH patients really are at the heart of what we do. We regulate the whole gamut of medical devices from the low risk to the high risk across brand new technologies and new technologies that we're seeing. And our vision really starts with what's really key, that patients in the U.S. And patients are really what it's all about. And it's really about the whole ecosystem, too. It's not even just CDRH, but it's really a shared vision across the medical device ecosystem that we're all in it and we're all here to serve the patients. So the next slide. We've really seen, this is an example of just one submission of one PMA where we have mountains of evidence that we have to review, and each reviewer has, anywhere between 5, 10, 15, 20 different submissions that they're really dealing with. And you can see that's just one file in a actually surprisingly clean office that shows all that they have to deal with. So when we first put out that benefit risk guidance that Ross had mentioned earlier, that helps give people a sort of a structure and a framework to really change the way we thought about all of this data and all this mountain of evidence, to really look at it in sort of a consistent way where we're all thinking on the same page and laying out that worksheet in terms of what are the benefits, what are the risks, and sort of putting that all together. The next slide. This sort of helped us sort of evaluate all the evidence and sort of think past, there are all those different pieces of evidence, or almost the trees, and really looking at the whole forest, and let's not lose the forest in between all the little bits and pieces of data, and really think about how can we weigh the benefits and the risks and be able to scale those in context and really be able to take patient input into that process and really look at what's important to patients as far as their benefits and risks, and really getting that input in a way that we can understand it. Next slide. So we start to lay the groundwork to really evaluate the science of patient inputs, kind of one of the terms we've been hearing now, and really be able to put that into a more holistic process rather than the sort of ad hoc way that we had been getting patient input, and really lay that groundwork. A lot of the work has been with MDIC to really come up with a way to validly and scientifically put the benefit risk, patient input into the benefit risk and help weigh those. Next slide. So we launched the Patient Preference Initiative as a way to really elicit and measure the voice of the patients and incorporate that throughout the device total product lifecycle. So we really wanted to understand what are the barriers that patients have faced thus far in the regulatory process, as well as looking at the way to incorporate those perspectives in our benefit risk decisions, and really doing that in a way that is valid scientific evidence. And then finally, really advancing, how can we advance the state of the science in measuring patient preferences? As Ross talked about earlier, this is really a nascent field, so how can we best advance the field so that we can address a lot of the questions that are still out there? The next slide. And this is a simplified version of the total product lifecycle and where patient input could be incorporated across the total product lifecycle, just to show some of the areas where patient preferences could really, and perspectives could really be important. So in terms of discovery and ideation, where you're talking about having patients involved in terms of informing the needs to help inform device design, into the clinical trial process and looking at patient-informed clinical trial design that has the benefits of both learning what are the meaningful outcomes to patients as part of what's the data that's being collected in the trial, as well as designing the protocols themselves to have the patients in mind so that the study will actually be feasible for patients to enroll and may help with retention and recruitment as well. And then the focus of our work, a lot of our work so far has, of course, been on the benefit risk assessments and how we can incorporate patient preference information as part of the benefit risk assessments, which is part of the guidance that I'll talk about shortly. And then one of the large issues and one of the pieces that Ross also just mentioned is about how do we communicate benefit risk information in a way to ensure that patients understand what are the risks and what are the probable benefits for a potential treatment that they may undertake. And then looking in terms of post-market, in terms of whether it's patient-reported outcomes, patient-centered outcomes, and how that may help design and improve the next generation of devices. Next slide. So it's really a collaborative process where we've been building sort of that groundwork that I talked about earlier with the MDIC framework and catalog that you heard from Ross about, the obesity study that I will touch on briefly, as well as the draft guidance, which I will go into, as well as Ross has said, about patient-reported outcomes are certainly slightly outside of the scope of patient preferences, but certainly important as part of looking at device design and evaluation in a patient-centric manner. Next slide. The study on obesity that was briefly mentioned by Ross. So this was really the first sort of proof of concept, at least on the device side, on how to really elicit and incorporate patient preferences. So we created a survey. It was a discrete choice experiment with treatments involving different benefit-risk trade-offs that were preference sensitive. And this was done to sort of, we knew that down the pike there was going to be a lot of various obesity devices coming with various diverse benefit-risk profiles. And at the time of the study, the gastric band was the only approved device in the U.S. And as shown and previously, and now the citation for this study in surgical endoscopy. Next slide. So this led to the creation, the study led to the creation of a decision aid tool that we've been using both internally about where you can type in the various characteristics of a device and be able to, based on the survey results from the patients, see what is the maximum acceptable risk that a patient would tolerate given the outcomes and the features and attributes of the device, as well as what is the minimal acceptable weight loss. So what is, to be able to really look at that trade-off that what patients would be interested in terms of this is the minimal acceptable benefit that I'll take in terms of weight loss for this amount of risk. And then also, that calculator can also help determine what percent of the patients would say that this potential new treatment is actually better than no treatment at all. So next slide. So this decision aid tool has is also able to report on different levels of risk tolerance, whether patients are high risk, medium risk, or low risk, and really be able to look at those different levels and calculate those different types of attributes in terms of what patients are willing to accept. And so those estimated values can really help inform clinicians in terms of what is the minimal clinically meaningful benefit to really size, design, and evaluate trials. So that's back to the idea of the clinical trial design and how we can really look at what are the meaningful outcomes with patients and come up with what that really would be based on actual patient input. And we've applied this to our regulatory decision-making processes. The Maestro device was approved in January of 2015, and the decision to approve the Maestro was really based partially on data that showed that there was a substantial portion of obese patients that would accept the risk associated with the device if they lost that sufficient amount of pounds in terms of, so it really helped with our benefit risk assessments. And we think that this quantitative method can certainly be used and applied in other disease areas, and as Ross talked about in terms of the future research agendas, that could certainly be areas where we'd like to explore or see studies coming in as well. And the obesity study used one method of the many methods that are available in the catalog, and that's certainly somewhere we'd like to see more work and see more studies using different methods to see what are the different, whether we'll get similar results. Next slide. So specifically on the guidance, which also does not have a easy to spit out title, it doesn't come trippingly off the tongue. Patient preference information, submission, review, and PMAs, HDs, humanitarian device exemptions, as well as de novo requests and inclusion in device labeling. And this guidance really, we applied this to both industry and to interested parties because we really see this as being a multi-stakeholder issue and recognize that it's a larger stakeholder than really just industry, and that the interests for both industry and even for patient groups and other interested parties are going to be slightly different as to why they'd like to do a patient preference study. So in terms of industry, it can really help industry get to the same page as FDA reviewers, and we're all talking about getting patient input and understanding on the same page what are the benefits and risks and the attributes that really matter to patients. And by taking patient preference into account across the total product life cycle, it can really help move products and help improve access to new products, new devices to market. And from the industry, or from the patient group and academic and other perspectives, it can really help elucidate in a valid scientific way, what are the patient preferences, and rather than sort of that ad hoc, one patient representative on an advisory committee and some patients who come speak at a committee and just, letters that we get in, and really have patient groups harness their communities. A lot of patient groups, have really become very sophisticated and have lots of methods and lots of membership that can really get across that heterogeneity and be representative of their larger populations as a whole. So the objectives of the draft guidance are four. One is that patient preference information is voluntary. Then we go into what are the recommended qualities of patient preference studies and how that could be construed as valid scientific evidence. What are the recommendations for collecting patient preference information? And then going into some of our recommendations for labeling. Next slide. In terms of voluntary submission, so again, this is voluntary, and there are not always going to be places where patient preference information may be relevant. So we really lay out in the guidance that we would consider patient preference information as part of the totality of evidence, including all of the clinical and non-clinical testing for pre-market that we are asked for in pre-market review. And this is one piece sort of the benefit risk determination, and this draft guidance does not change any of our review standards for safety and effectiveness, nor does it create any extra burden for sponsors. Next slide. So as Ross had said in the nice 2x2 chart, that patient preference information may not be relevant in all areas or appropriate. If something is a high benefit and low risk, so pretty much everyone sort of knows that it's something that's going to be probably patients are going to be interested in that. And then also areas where it's really, the patients aren't really involved in the piece, in the device, like a surgical tool. So it's really much more of a surgeon preference than the patient preference. And we really see that patient preference information can be useful in those areas where the decisions are preference sensitive, which Ross brought up a bit earlier. And how we see some of those examples are things like devices where there's a direct patient interface, devices that are intended to yield some kind of health or appearance benefit related to direct quality of life. Certainly in that high-risk, high-benefit area, like certain life-saving but high-risk devices that you saw in the 2x2 chart. Devices that fill an unmet need in an area where there is no treatment now, and areas where there are novel technologies where we don't know fully how the device is going to work, so knowing how patients are willing to accept probable risks and probable benefits is going to be helpful for that. Next slide. So we go into, the next section of the guidance really goes into what are the recommended qualities for a patient preference study. And we specifically made this to be about qualities, and we listed about 11 total, understanding that right now the science is nascent, so we really don't have all the answers. So we couldn't, similar to in the framework and in the catalog, we really can't be prescriptive in terms of you need to do X, Y, and Z, or follow this recipe to get a patient preference study, but rather kind of what are the qualities of patient preference studies that could be considered, and if those studies have these qualities would be potentially considered as valid scientific evidence. So some of these qualities include representativeness, so the idea that the patient population that's surveyed does cover the whole spectrum of patients, high risk, low risk, moderate risk, people in potentially different stages of disease, different treatments, just to really ensure that we're talking more holistically about a whole patient population and not just picking a few samples. Heterogeneity, so really looking at similar idea, making sure that the population is heterogeneous. It's not just these 3 patients who all have the same preferences and the same ideas and the same people who keep talking to us. We want to ensure that the studies also minimize cognitive bias so that we ensure that the results are valid. And part of that includes effective communication, so ensuring that the risks, the benefits, the uncertainties, the harms are really communicated in a way that patients will understand that, so when they fill out the surveys, they're able to really give us their true preferences. And then certainly following robust analysis and following good clinical and research practices to ensure the validity and reproducibility of the results. So as what we saw in the research agenda and some of Ross's discussions, there's really a lot to do in this area, so that's really why we kept it broader in terms of talking about what are those qualities of patient preference studies. Next slide. In terms of submission of patient preference information, we really want to encourage stakeholders, whether industry, patient groups, any other interested parties who want to conduct a patient preference study, to really come talk to us early. And whether you want to come talk to us about your protocol or you have a study and you think that there's some interest for a regulatory purpose, come talk to us. You can contact me directly for right now. And we really also see that the types of studies and the submissions of the studies are really going to differ depending on the scope of the study and are going to differ depending on the different stakeholders. So we may see some patient preference studies that are really application or device specific that come in with a specific submission, as well as others that are really broader about a specific disease area or condition or broader to a device class. So certainly the obesity study, for example, would be in that sort of disease condition type of area. Next slide. In terms of communication, we really certainly, and I think everyone agrees, and this came up a lot in the MDIC work and what Ross discussed, is that there needs to be a clear way in ensuring that the communication of patient preferences, if it is a part of our the approval decision, is really communicated in a clear way. So sponsors should really need to make sure that they include the plan for how they would intend to communicate that patient preference information, both to patients and healthcare professionals. And that this labeling should include the study data, including what are those range of preferences and characteristics of patients who consider the device's probable benefits to outweigh its probable risk, so that way patients have an understanding in terms of figuring out where they fall into that device, into that benefit risk area. And that patient labeling should use terminology and numerical data that's easily recognized and understood. And just a plug, CDRH will be hosting a workshop on September 29th and 30th on patient labeling. The information's on the FDA website. I didn't have the link, so I was sorry unable to put it into this presentation. Next slide. We also further into the draft guidance further talk about how patient preference information can be applied in regulatory decision making. So we put in hypothetical examples in areas to sort of elucidate how patient preference information could be used. This might be areas where the data helps us inform the benefit risks, where the reviewers that may have had a different thoughts of what benefits and risks were important to them, and then the patient preference data helped us make the benefit risk scale tip differently, as well as looking at patient preference information and seeing that even at the end of the day, the risks still outweighed any probable benefit, and then also looking at sort of in the pediatric space as well, looking at sort of the patient-parent preferences as well in terms of surrogate preferences when you're talking about whether you're talking about caregivers or patients. We incorporated additional detail in the patient-centric factors of the benefit risk worksheet, and we are looking for feedback on the draft guidance. We have specific questions about labeling as well as about the whole any feedback about the guidance overall, and that docket closes on August 18th. And then we are working internally on training sort of to ensure that reviewers are able to scrutinize and review these patient preference studies and ensure that they are valid scientific evidence. Next slide. So in summary, patients really are at the heart of what we do. We are committed to integrating the patient voice into our regulatory decision making. There's been significant progress with the MDIC work and our draft guidance, but we really say this really is a burgeoning field. Dr. Califf at the MDIC PCBR rollout really kind of put it up. We're looking to really build a field here and really build up the capacity and build up the ability for us to be able to harness all this patient data in a way that we can inform patient-centric device development, evaluation, and delivery. And that's what I have, Stephanie, so I'll turn it back over to you.
Great, thank you, Annie. Well, we have about 10 minutes remaining here for some questions, and I do have our first question in already. If anyone else has questions they'd like to submit, please use the chat box on the bottom of your screen. Our first question says, you've presented obesity devices as an example. Are there other examples where patient preference information has been used to inform a regulatory decision? For example, transcatheter heart valve was mentioned as a potential example.
Go ahead, Annie.
The obesity studies, they don't sort of the real first patient preference survey that's really been done in the device sphere that we've really seen come in. I think Ross mentioned transcatheter heart valves as an idea of a potential area where it certainly could be of interest, and I'll let Ross elaborate.
Yeah, no, when we looked around, actually, the obesity example is the only formal example we can find of one, a patient preference study applied to a medical technology specifically, and two, one that was such information being used in the regulatory process. And as Annie mentioned, the approval of my spray device from Teramedics in this past winter, and then more recently a couple of obesity devices in the last few weeks, have illustrated the potential value of that study in helping to inform regulatory decision making. But we couldn't identify any other formal examples. The example of the transcatheter heart valve that I mentioned was a hypothetical example, but it was just more to give a sense of what how it might be valuable in a situation where you've got a high benefit device, but also one that has significant risk. And in the case of the transcatheter aortic valve, such information may have accelerated or helped accelerate the approval here in the U.S. because I know that there was a lot of concern that while these valves were beneficial, there was also a significant stroke risk. But I think if you had actually surveyed patients and looked at the issue of stroke risk, they said, look, I'm a non-operative patient, I'm going to die of my heart disease, I'll take the stroke risk. Having that information may have helped inform the regulatory decision and accelerate that process. So I think the transcatheter heart valve, in my mind, was one of the examples that got me thinking about the potential value of this information back before we started the project. And we'd love to see more examples of this, and certainly want to encourage people to think about how collecting this information may help accelerate the regulatory approval process by helping to give reviewers a real understanding of how patients are viewing these risks and benefits and how they view the trade-offs.
Great, thank you. Our next question, which methods would you recommend to achieve minimal cognitive bias when comparing mild and very serious risks?
Well, overall, just in terms of minimizing cognitive bias, one of the features of a lot of patient preference studies, not just the obesity study, there's been work that was done for Duchenne muscular dystrophy as well as doing pre-testing with patients to really be able to look at and make sure that they're understanding things, and then through that pre-test, you're really able to understand what patients think when they read those words, and that may have been different than what the intent was, and so that's really one of probably the best methods to really ensure that you're minimizing cognitive bias.
Great, thank you. Ross, I'll direct this question towards you, I think. What's MDIC's role with FDA regulatory submission process? If we would conduct a patient preference study, should we collaborate with MDIC, and if so, how?
Well, yeah, I'm glad to answer that, Stephanie. First, I'd say that MDIC does not have any formal role with the FDA regulatory submission process, and that we don't want to be in a role of getting between a sponsor and the FDA. That's got to be a direct interaction. I think we at the MDIC would like to see, patient preference studies done, and we are certainly available to help, make connections and facilitate a study, but we don't see the role of MDIC as getting directly involved in studies. Certainly we don't have any funding to do that. We are glad to really help and facilitate a process, help make sure you have access to some of the experts we work with, those types of things. In other words, we want to facilitate these studies and encourage them, but we can't, we're not actively involved in funding or sponsoring them.
Certainly, MDIC's role is sort of in that pre-competitive space. There wouldn't be a regulatory submission for a specific device, but if there were areas, so say something like the obesity study that's going to affect a broad stakeholder interest that MDIC has, that's certainly something that could be brought up to Ross and Stephanie as a discussion for potential area where MDIC could help with.
Great, thank you. And I'll just add to that, if you're interested in learning more about MDIC's work and how you can get involved specifically with MDIC's Patient Preference Initiative, you can reach out to us. I believe our contact information was on the website when you registered. So certainly, if you're interested in getting involved in future initiatives with MDIC, please reach out to us and let us know.
Stephanie, there's a question here I see about the 2x2 table. Should I take that?
Yeah, sure.
So the question is, for a 2x2 table, usually low benefit, high risk scenarios dominated situation. How much weight PPI information will have in a situation like this in regulatory decision? And that's right. Usually in a low benefit, high risk scenario, you'd say, why would you approve that product? But one of the interesting things in the original benefit risk guidance is statements that even if there's a subset of patients for whom benefit exceeds risk, even if that subset is a minority of patients or a small group of patients, the product should be approved for that group of patients. And so you can see using patient preference information to help identify that there may be a subset of patients for whom they would prefer so they would take the risk of that technology, the high risk of that technology for the low benefit, even if the majority of patients would not. And that's where patient preference information might be helpful in identifying that subset of patients.
Great, thank you, Ross. And thank you to both of you for being here on this call today and for sharing information both about the framework and CDRH's draft guidance. Up on the screen here, I want to remind everyone that the framework report is now available for download on MDIC's website. And as Ross said, we appreciate feedback on this report, and we view this as a living document, that this is something that will be updated as companies and patient groups and as CDRH gain more experience with these patient preference studies. So we encourage your feedback and your continued collaboration with us. Also on the screen, as Annie mentioned, the CDRH draft guidance is the docket is still open for comment. I believe it's open until August 18th. So if there are comments you would like to submit, you can do that here. I also want to mention our next MDICx teleconference that takes place on Wednesday, August 12th, again at 12 p.m. Eastern. The topic will be advancing the use of central IRBs. And this webinar is part of our ongoing collaboration with the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, or CITI, which is another public-private partnership that's really working to innovate in clinical trials. And CITI and MDIC have been working together on areas of common interest and where we can continue to collaborate to improve the regulatory environment. So we encourage you to sign up for that. The registration is now live for that August 12th event. And we thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Stephanie. Take care.
Thanks, Stephanie, and everyone for joining.